Okay, well, thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge my dissertation committee, without whom I would not be here today. My chair and methodologist, Dr. Walker Ladd, and my readers, Doctors Mary Kay Chess and Jorianne Calder-Lockhart. There are not enough words for how much your guidance, encouragement, and support have meant to me, so I'll save them for the presentation. Today, I am pleased to present my research exploring the experiences of living a calling in organizational change. As my committee has already read my dissertation, I'll touch briefly upon the inquiry's context, then focus on the heart of my inquiry, the data analysis, key findings, and their relevance. I'll close with some brief reflections on this inquiry's limitations, implications, and areas for future research. Mary Kay and Jorianne, you included some great questions in your feedback, so I will be addressing them as those topics arise. Thank you again for being here, and let's get started. So researcher interest in career calling has increased over the last 15 years, yet little research explores what it's actually like to live one's calling in general and within organizational contexts specifically. Given the importance of an organization's ability to successfully navigate change, and considering that organizational change failure rates have averaged over 70% for the last 4 decades, I find this lack of research intriguing. Calling research suggests that workers living their callings generate numerous organizational benefits, which relate to and might help with organizational change efforts. So, understanding the experience of people living their callings within this context may offer some valuable insights into what it takes to successfully navigate organizational change. My research question was this: what is the experience of living one's calling within the context of organizational change work? To prepare for my study, I conducted an extensive review of the calling literature published between 2009 and 2024, and that represents the time during which the research community really began to focus on career calling or work as calling. I also reviewed literature on organizational change to provide context for the living a calling phenomenon, and reviewed various literature addressing the theoretical frameworks upon which the study was designed, including work as calling theory. From my review of the calling literature, 3 clear gaps emerged. First, I could find no literature addressing the experience of living a calling in organizational change. Second, I noticed a lack of voices of lived experience represented in the calling literature. And third, the majority of the calling literature I reviewed was quantitative. And when I say the majority, I'm talking 40 out of 59 articles. That's 68%. Only 17 of those articles reviewed represented qualitative research. And of those, over half represented conceptual papers and literature reviews. So that means that only 8 of those 59 articles, or 14%, presented qualitative research involving the participants. So I saw an opportunity to contribute qualitative insights in a novel way. But which way? So I thought back to an experience with my last employer, where the company's chief operating officer said to me, Jeannel, you're a unicorn. We don't know what to do with you. And I laughed at the time, but I was also taken aback because while I worked differently than the company's organizational development team for sure, and I achieved exceptional results facilitating teams for the company, was I really that hard to understand? And was I really that unique? That unicorn comment planted a question in the back of my mind that I've pondered for years. Is it just me, or do other people experience this too? As someone who lives her calling and has worked for years in organizational change contexts, I have a deep autobiographical connection to my topic that's grown from a profound curiosity over the years into an enduring fascination. However, I wanted to understand my experience through those of others living their callings in organizational change contexts. So this desire helped shape my research question, which then shaped my choice of method, Heuristic inquiry. Heuristic inquiry, or HI, is a versatile and creative research method developed by humanistic psychologist Clark Mustakis in the 1960s. It's related to phenomenology in that both provide a pathway to understanding the essential nature of a phenomenon. However, the philosophy behind HI bears marked differences. Heuristic inquiry is not grounded in a specific philosophy per se. Rather, it's grounded in the tenets of humanistic psychology and various non-directive counseling practices. It's postmodernist in its emphasis that a researcher is intrinsically connected to their topic of research. And this means that as a researcher, I'm not a separate observer conducting research, but rather an active participant or co-researcher in the inquiry. Moreover, a phenomenon can be experienced in myriad ways by myriad people. Therefore, there is no single source of truth or one right answer to a research question. Heuristic researchers access their tacit knowing, which Polanyi described as knowing more than we can say. This tacit knowing is the foundation of all knowledge, especially since each of us constructs or interprets our worlds as we experience them. Ultimately, a heuristic researcher does not seek to understand or describe the essential nature of the phenomenon itself, but rather the essential nature of the lived experience of the phenomenon. So throughout my inquiry, I drew upon 7 processes to truly immerse myself in the research question. These processes were my guides as I navigated the 6 phases of heuristic inquiry, from initial engagement with the phenomenon and data collection, to rounds of data immersion and incubation, to illuminating and explicating themes and key findings, and finally representing the essential nature of the lived experience as a creative synthesis. So through these processes and phases, I was able to connect deeply with my topic and understand its intricacies. To explore my research question, I collected data from 8 individuals who self-identified as living their callings and working within organizational change contexts. Mary Kay, I listed no geographic inclusion or exclusion criteria for my study because I sought to understand the lived experience of the phenomenon in general. I used a 2-pronged recruitment approach to find my co-researchers, seeking referrals through purposive sampling methods and recruiting via LinkedIn self-referral. Of the 16 individuals expressing interest, I accepted the first 8 who met the inclusion criteria and returned signed informed consent packets as my co-researchers for this study. Interestingly, though, all of the potential co-researchers lived and worked in the United States, so it naturally provided a geographic scope to my inquiry. With these 8 co-researchers, I conducted 90-minute semi-structured interviews via Zoom to learn about their experiences of living a calling in organizational change contexts. The collected data included interview audio recordings, transcripts, creative artifacts shared by my co-researchers, their member checking feedback, and my reflexive journal entries. The co-researchers involved in this inquiry were majority white, all resided and worked in the United States, and all were college educated. However, I don't want to introduce my co-researchers to you all because of these criteria. I want to introduce them to you as I know them. So let me introduce you to my real co-researchers. First, there's Blondie. Hi, Blondie, right here. Blondie is a corporate trainer and creative being in her mid-50s who grew up, as she says, on the wrong side of the tracks. She identifies with being a minority student at a minority college. Her current calling is to help others see what's possible for themselves and grow into their full potential. Next, we have Berna. Berna is an organizational consultant and visual facilitator, like myself, in her 40s, not like myself, an Enneagram devotee who draws upon heart-centered wisdom in all things. Her current calling is to connect people to themselves and others in a more heartfelt way in service to all of us surviving on this planet. Leona is a mom and a Lean Six Sigma black belt in her early 50s who chafed against her profession's process heavy focus and took a risk by reshaping her practice to be more person centered. Her current calling is to help people navigate complex change, even as she goes deeper with her personal evolution journey. Luciana is a Latina single mom in her mid-50s who works as a DE&I executive in higher education. She identifies as an edgewalker and was the first in her family to attend and graduate from college. Luciana's current calling is to ensure marginalized people have a seat at the table and a voice in the conversations that matter. Moving to the bottom row, we have Ariadne, who is an organizational consultant and visual facilitator in her late 50s, who is a human design devotee and a sailor. She actually identifies as a wayfinder, drawing upon deep water wisdom to serve others. Her current calling deepened from what she called simply providing services to others to owning her responsibility and emerging role as an elder to contributing to the health and thriving of the collective. Trevor is a psychologist and nonprofit founder in his mid-60s who identifies as an actor and a recovering Catholic. Leaving a secure position job or secure corporate job to pursue his passion, Trevor's current calling is to help others learn to express themselves more fully in order to transform their work, relationships, and lives. Oops. Grady is a counselor in his early 70s who founded a commercial real estate investment company. He identifies as gay, vegan, and a hardcore introvert, like myself. Grady's current calling is to develop a space where professionals can engage passionately in the work of their callings without having to worry about their calling being their primary source of income. Lastly, we have Thomas. Thomas is in his mid-60s, and he's the founder of an organizational consulting firm that helps teams and leaders access unconventional wisdom. Now, this type of wisdom helped Thomas survive as a homeless youth, and his current calling is to build a movement for living that type of collective wisdom in support of humankind's survival and evolution. During my co-researcher interviews, I asked 5 key questions to help me understand their lived experience. I wanted to learn more about how they described calling, how they experienced calling in their lives and at work, the challenges they faced, and how their callings changed over time. After all interviews were complete, I analyzed each co-researcher's data set one at a time using Mastakis's data analysis protocol. I engaged in multiple rounds of data immersion and incubation until I was able to illuminate the themes that emerged from their lived experiences. Through this process, I was able to explicate or make visible those experiences as individual and composite depictions. And I was also able to synthesize the essential nature of the collective lived experience into a creative product. But to give you a better sense of how this worked, let me walk you through an example using Blondie's dataset. So after Blondie member checked her transcript to ensure it was accurate and complete, I engaged in numerous, and I mean numerous, rounds of immersion and incubation with the data set. This process of immersion and incubation lasted between 1 to 2 weeks on average and involved constant focusing, indwelling, tacit knowing, self-dialogue, and intuitive pings, all of those 7 processes from heuristic inquiry. Once I felt confident in my understanding of Blondie's lived experience, I conducted a final data immersion through what I called a doodle listen, where I drew my notes to visually process the data as I listened to the audio recording of the interview. Continuing with more rounds of immersion, incubation, and illumination, I then explicated or made visible the essence and themes of Blondie's lived experience via an individual depiction. Now, this depiction was a digital booklet combining tone poems I wrote based on Blondie's words with my digital collage interpretations to help bring those themes to life and reflect her lived experience back to her. I then had Blondie member check the depiction and adjusted the content until Blondie could say a resounding, "Yes, that's me. I totally feel seen and heard." So, for example, this image on the left, the mummy originally was much smaller, yet Blondie wanted that mummy to fill the box to emphasize the claustrophobic and trapped feelings she had experienced in that moment in the story from which this image represented. So once Blondie's member check was done and she approved the depiction as accurate and complete, I then repeated this process for every co-researcher until I had individual depictions for them all. And from my analysis and depictions, I discovered various themes, which I will touch upon lightly as my committee has read my chapter 4. So starting with interview question 1, co-researchers consistently described calling as an ineffable energetic entity with a mind and a will of its own, and with whom or which they had an ongoing relationship. My co-researchers experienced iterative and evolving cycles of callings that increased its demands on them as they grew and self-actualized. Basically, calling required the individual to grow and self-actualize, which then required their current form of calling to evolve and deepen to keep the person growing and actualizing. Interestingly, question 2 generated the most data, and question 3 generated the least, because co-researchers didn't differentiate between living their callings at work or otherwise. Their callings were their callings. Co-researchers prioritized their callings over specific work needs, roles, contexts. There we go. The primary challenges co-researchers shared were between themselves and their callings, focusing on fears of letting their callings down or not doing enough to live up to their callings, and the ego frustrations of trying to force or control callings to a specific outcome. Lastly, co-researchers experienced their callings as taking deeper forms over their lifetimes, moving from early callings focused on self-oriented goal achievement to a later life orientation to be of service to others and the planet. From my analysis, 3 key findings emerged. First, co-researchers described a consistent pattern of experience while living their callings, suggesting an iterative, evolving, and relational life cycle. Second, work context was irrelevant to my co-researchers. When they lived their callings, it transcended or was louder than any specific work context, including organizational change. Lastly, co-researchers consistently prioritize living their callings over job roles or work expectations, illustrating that their work was subservient to their callings and not the other way around. Equipped with these themes and findings, I re-engaged in rounds of immersion, incubation, and illumination until I could create a composite depiction of all co-researchers' lived experiences. Because work context was irrelevant for all of my co-researchers living their callings, I excluded it from the composite and instead focused on depicting the experience pattern of living a calling. And it starts with a mundane experience right down here. For example, Berna distinctly remembered being in a work meeting when someone began talking about organizational development. All of a sudden, she experienced the sudden realization, a visceral reaction to that sudden clarity, like the sounding of a tuning fork, as Bernard described it. You know, she'd say, "Ding! This is what I'm meant to do." This sudden insight resonated inside of her on physical and spiritual levels, calling forth this resounding yes from the root of her being. So Berna's having this mundane experience at work when she experiences a sudden realization that resonates with every pore of her being. She then faces a choice: say yes to this newly perceived calling or say no. And actually, according to all my co-researchers, this is really a false or Hobson's choice, because as Thomas said, When there's alignment like this, there's no saying no to it. There's not even a saying yes to it. It just is. It's happening. We're going with it. Or as Berna put it, look, I can't not do something when I feel like that, when I feel that. Like I would die if I couldn't do this. Interestingly, Luciana addressed the choice to say no to an emerging calling, saying that, sure, I mean, technically, I could choose not to follow the call, yet I have no other choice because it's that painful not to. So once the person perceives and accepts their emergent calling, they then proceed to actualize or live it. In living their callings, co-researchers described being well used by the universe or by source, feeling fully seen and heard for who they am and what they can do, knowing that they were making a difference in the lives of others and having an impact in ways that mattered. They could connect all the dots effortlessly. They knew just what to do in the moment and had the ability to do it, even if they've never done it before. As they all said, the way or the path was open. And these experiences of fully actualizing self and calling led to what Trevor called the high. He shared that it feels like you're on top of the world, you're higher than high, and you don't even need any drugs or alcohol to feel this way. However, over time, the calling starts to fade. What once provided so much life, energy, and meaning seemed to close. As Berna shared, it just doesn't have the same energy for me. And once the co-researchers experienced the fate of their current callings, they began to chase the feeling their calling used to provide. Berna explained that you know what it's like to live fully actualized with your calling, so you want more of that. But the calling continues to fade until it's gone, leaving the co-researchers grieving the loss of that form of calling. As Grady put it, there was a grief for me when my calling started to lessen, and it was confusing. I thought this was it, but now it's not. The death of their previous calling leaves co-researchers in a gestation period or wait space. During this phase, co-researchers maintained a contemplative and receptive interior quality of being within the self, where they could hold the question of what the next form of their calling wanted to be. And they did so with full faith that a next calling would come. As Luciana described it, you got to sit in the mud for a while and let the next calling emerge. However, co-researchers also described what Leona called the Valley of Despair. And the box with the mummy from Blondie's depiction is a good representation of this space. I mean, it's basically the hell of a slow spiritual death. Co-researchers shared that in this space, you're depressed. You feel like you're dying inside. You feel like you're wasting your life. Everything you try to do comes to naught. You look in the mirror and you see yourself physically wasting away. Saying no to one's emergent calling or failing to maintain the wait space inside of oneself upon the loss of one's current calling were the pathways to the valley of despair that my co-researchers described. Yet when they could return to that wait space, cultivating that inner quality of being, sitting in that liminal space, holding the question without trying to answer it, and having full faith that the next form of calling would come, they went about their lives until they had another mundane experience where all of the sudden, ding, they perceive the insight of their next calling and the cycle starts all over again. Now, it's important to note, though, that the next form of calling co-researchers experienced was what they considered a higher form. The cycle wasn't flat or static. Rather, calling evolved with the co-researchers' personal and spiritual growth in an upward spiral. These findings are relevant to the career callings research field as a whole, and they contribute to a new understanding of living a calling amidst organizational change. They open new avenues for calling research and contribute to a more nuanced framework for understanding and navigating living a calling. In particular, this distinct pattern of experience to living a calling not only enhances our understanding, but challenges work as calling theory by introducing some unique variables. So let's dig a bit deeper into work as calling theory and the relevance of this study. In 2018, Duffy and colleagues introduced work as calling theory as a way to standardize how calling was researched in a highly fractured field. According to this framework, let's get that right over here. Boop. There we go. A person perceives a calling and then considers their fit with their work environment. Factors that may influence this transition include a person's calling motivation, job crafting, and level of organizational support. With person, work environment, or PE fit in place, a person can then experience increased work meaning and career commitment, leading them to live their calling, which increases their experience of work satisfaction and career commitment, and so on. And these two stages in the framework are mediated by an individual's access to opportunity to live their callings. As an individual lives their callings, they can experience positive and negative outcomes, all work-oriented. While their job satisfaction and performance could increase, there was also a risk of workaholism, burnout, or exploitation by their employer. However, these negative outcomes could be mitigated by the individual's personality and psychological climate. So this was the original framework. But then in 2019, there we go, Duffy and colleagues validated the model, there we go, and made some adjustments. The basic chain of events stayed the same, but the variables of calling motivation, job crafting, and organizational support were removed, and access to opportunity was replaced by a new variable, work volition. Let's zoom back out. There we go. So what happens when we compare the living a calling life cycle pattern of experience to work as calling theory? For this comparison, I blended the 2018 and 2019 work as calling, or WCT, models because I found relevance for both. The living a calling life cycle, or LACLC, and WCT both start with the perception of calling. And according to the LACLC, that starts with a mundane experience, leading to a sudden realization with which the individual experiences such a strong resonance that they have no choice but to accept their calling. So both WCT and LACLC both agree with removing the variables affecting the path to living a calling. However, the LACLC suggests a shift in focus. Calling motivation in WCT reflects the level of effort a person is willing to invest to pursue a calling. Yet my co-researchers described a Hobson's choice. They had no alternative but to follow the call. In WCT, job crafting is the extent to which a person can alter their work environment to better support their calling. However, my co-researchers followed their callings regardless of what their jobs were or the obstacles they presented. Instead, their focus was on holistic life crafting, a comprehensive approach of cognition, environment, personal interest, relationship, resources, skills, and tasks to create a meaningful life that would support them living their callings. Lastly, organizational support in WCT represents the amount of encouragement, assistance, and care that the person experiences from their company or employer. Yet my co-researchers provided numerous examples of living their calling in the absence of organizational supports. Instead, co-researchers spoke to the level of organizational receptivity, or leadership and management's response to the voice of their employees. Were the organizations receptive to the co-researchers living their callings at work in the first place? Move down to the next step regarding PE fit. Within WCT, PE fit represents the compatibility of an individual's personal characteristics with their work environment. Co-researchers, though, could navigate, modify, and adapt to create opportunities in the environments within which they actualize those callings. What did not change, though, were their values. Was the environment, employer, or client in alignment with the enduring beliefs co-researchers embodied as they lived their callings? When an environment didn't fit a co-researcher's characteristics, they could often adapt or navigate their way through that environment in ways that better served their needs. When an environment did not align with a co-researcher's values, the co-researchers followed their values to the point of discarding the environment in some cases. On the other side, the LACLC and WCT agree on work volition, that is the person's perceived sense of agency at work. Both also agree on living a calling, yet the LACLC demonstrates an iterative and evolving cycle to living a calling rather than the closed-ended approach illustrated by WCT. Additionally, while WCT offered positive and negative outcomes that were work-oriented, such as increased job performance or risk of workaholism, my co-researchers' positive and negative outcomes were decidedly person-centered. Indeed, my co-researchers' lived experiences suggest that instead of work as calling, a more fitting framework could be calling at work in the world. As I reflect on my study, I realize that there are certain limitations that I need to discuss. First is the issue of privilege. I conducted this study with a fairly privileged and homogeneous sample. 7 out of 8 of my co-researchers were white, all were middle-aged and older, all were college educated, all are living and working in the United States. Additionally, I, as a co-researcher, am a white American completing this research as part of my Ph.D., which automatically adds another layer of privilege. So it's important to consider how privilege may affect calling and the results of the study, which are prime areas for future research. Another limitation of my study is the context of organizational change. When I designed this inquiry, I thought the context of organizational change would matter. And from my co-researchers' lived experiences and even reflecting upon my own, it turns out that this context was irrelevant. We live our callings wherever we are, whatever we're doing. However, without including organizational change as the work context for this study, I wouldn't have discovered its irrelevance to these findings. Would this finding hold up with a different or larger sample? I don't know. This relationship between living a calling and work context, though, is another area for really interesting future research. Although the findings from this research may not be generalized to other populations due to the study's small sample size, I do see implications for the various parties connected to this research. Specifically, I want to speak to the implications for organizational change leaders, managers, and the organizations themselves. Mary Kay, as we know, individuals living their callings at work present organizations with myriad benefits, including increased job performance, enhanced creative problem solving, innovation, higher organizational citizenship behaviors, increased loyalty, and so on. And additionally, these benefits appear to influence the performance of these individuals' co-workers. So it yields additional benefits to the organizations beyond the called individual. Yet this study demonstrated that co-researchers living their callings prioritized their callings over specific work needs or roles and honored the values aligned with their callings over those of the organization. For leaders, managers, and organizations, the study's findings suggest that a paradigm shift might be beneficial, if not essential, for achieving the successful change that they seek. Individuals living their callings can be powerful allies and facilitators for an organization's change efforts, so long as they experience values alignment. Taking a more person and values-centric approach to change could flip the dominant organizational change paradigm on its head. And this is research I look forward to conducting in the future. In fact, this study sets an abundant table for future research. In addition to the recommendations previously mentioned, this study demonstrates a clear opportunity for new qualitative contributions to understanding living a calling and living a calling within various work contexts. The methods used for such studies would, of course, be determined by the research questions we sought to explore, Dorian. And this research experience leaves me with far more questions than when I started. Additionally, the new variables introduced by the living a calling life cycle pattern may provide fruitful pathways for enriching our understanding of calling's various facets, as seen by the comparison to WCT. Further research would be beneficial to discover if and how that pattern is experienced by others living their callings, and if merited, developed into a theoretical framework. Lastly, there are plentiful opportunities for specifically exploring the relationship between living a calling and the implementation and outcomes of organizational change efforts. While that was beyond the scope of this inquiry, that relationship is one I very much look forward to exploring. I'd like to thank my guests on this call for being a part of this moment. You mean the world to me, and it truly means the world that you were here. To my committee, thank you again for everything you have been and done to help me reach this point in my journey. I wanted to give thanks to my amazing co-researchers who gave themselves so generously to this project. And lastly, I want to give thanks to my inquiry itself for a journey I could never have imagined. Darn it, I thought I'd get through it without crying. I am beyond grateful.